How many civilizations existed on Earth before the Great Flood? For decades, this question has kept both archaeologists and historians in suspense. Although geological evidence and ancient texts suggest that at least 10 advanced lost civilizations may have flourished before this global catastrophe, mainstream scholarship often treats most of these clues as myth. But could the traditions of pre-flood cultures be true? If so, what were these 10 hidden worlds? Do we still share a connection with them across thousands of years? And finally, what happened to them? We will discover this together in this sleep documentary. Welcome to Hidden Past. Most of us inherit a simple picture of human history. First, small bands of hunters moved across the land. Then came farming, then villages, then cities, writing, kings, temples, and monuments. It feels clean because each step seems to explain the next. But on a hill in southeastern Turkey, that clean story begins to feel too small. The place is called Göbekli Tepe. There, long before the first familiar cities of Mesopotamia, people raised huge T-shaped pillars of limestone and arranged them in circles. Some of the stones stood taller than a person several times over. Their surfaces were carved with animals, foxes, snakes, birds, scorpions. Not random scratches, not simple marks of survival. Images cut carefully into stone as if the hill was holding a memory. And the age is what makes it difficult to ignore. Göbekli Tepe belongs to a time around 12,000 years ago, a time when the usual signs of civilization are not supposed to be there in any complete form. No writing, no known city streets, no palace records, no metal tools, no state standing behind the work, yet the stones are there. The familiar ladder says that people build monuments after they settle, after they farm, after they store enough food to feed workers, after leaders become powerful enough to organize labor. At Göbekli Tepe, the monument seems to appear near the beginning of that process, not at the end. That does not make the site a simple answer, it makes it a better question. What brought people back to this hill again and again? What belief, fear, memory, or promise was strong enough to gather them around stone? Why carve dangerous animals into pillars at a time when survival itself was still hard? And if this is only the oldest monument still visible, how much of the earlier human story has already disappeared? If this mystery pulls you in, like subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Göbekli Tepe matters because it does not need a fantasy to feel impossible. The stone is real. The carvings are visible. The labor can be felt. Every block had to be cut, shaped, moved, and raised by human hands. Every day spent on that work was a day not spent hunting, gathering, or repairing shelter. Something made the cost worth paying. The hill does not look like an ordinary settlement. It does not speak first of houses, streets, and storage rooms. It speaks of gathering, of return, of symbols placed where they could outlast the people who carved them. That is the first crack in the simple story. Maybe civilization was not born only from food and walls. Maybe it also grew from memory, from ritual, from the need to stand in one place and say, this matters, and we must come back. And if Göbekli Tepe is the first case, it is not because it gives us all 10 lost worlds at once. It is because it changes the question. The next part of the story is not about one hill. It is about what happens when the first stone turns out to have neighbours. The journey begins with a hill in southeastern Turkey. But before we walk that hill, it helps to understand what this episode will do. We are not moving through a ranked list. We are following 10 lost world traces scattered across the planet. Sacred centres that appeared too early, coastlines that drowned, settlements now under the sea, stonework that feels inherited, and ancient records that split time into before and after the flood. Each trace is a different piece of the same uneasy question. How many human worlds may have existed before the first ones we can easily read? None of these places alone will prove a lost global empire, but each one carries something a vanished world could leave behind. Think of it as a surviving surface. Most of what early people built, carried, or believed has disappeared. Wood rots, coastlines shift, stories die with the last voice. What remains is incomplete, like a damaged map where only the highest peaks still show above the water. These 10 cases are those peaks, and the first peak is a place that should not be there if the simple story of history were whole. The place is Göbekli Tepe. The name means potbelly hill, but the shape of the land hides what lies beneath. On this ridge, archaeologists uncovered circular enclosures made of massive T-shaped limestone pillars. These are not small stones. Some pillars reach over 5 meters in height and weigh several tons. They were cut from a nearby quarry, shaped with stone tools, dragged across uneven ground, and set upright into carved sockets in the bedrock. The faces of the pillars carry reliefs: foxes, snakes, birds, scorpions, boars, animals caught in stone with a clarity that still holds the eye thousands of years later. The date is what breaks the familiar picture. The oldest layers at Göbekli Tepe go back to around the 10th millennium before Christ. That is roughly 12,000 years ago, thousands of years before Stonehenge, before the first cities of Mesopotamia, before the invention of pottery, and crucially, before the full adoption of farming. The people who built this place lived in a world of hunting and gathering. They did not have permanent villages, metal tools, or written language, and yet they came to this hilltop again and again over generations to raise stone enclosures that served no obvious practical purpose. The structures did not store grain. They did not protect a settlement. They did not make hunting easier. Now think about what that cost. Every pillar meant days of quarrying, pounding and chipping at limestone with harder stone. Every ton of stone meant dragging it up a slope, probably with ropes and timber rollers, by the muscle of dozens of people. Those people needed food and water. Someone had to hunt, gather, or bring provisions. Someone had to coordinate where each pillar would stand. And all this effort was poured into a place where no one lived permanently. A day spent cutting stone was a day not spent on survival, so something must have made the work worth that cost. This is where the simple ladder of progress begins to feel too small. The standard story is not foolish. It says that humans moved in small bands, then gradually settled into farming villages, then grew into cities, and only then produced monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe reverses that order. It shows organized effort, shared design, and repeated ritual gathering before the full machinery of farming and cities is supposed to explain such things. The site is not a city. It is not an empire. But it is a scar on the clean timeline, a place where a different kind of human organization had already appeared, driven by something other than the next meal. What that something was remains an open question. Perhaps it was shared belief. Perhaps it was the memory of ancestors. Perhaps it was a need to mark the seasons, to honor animals, or to bind groups together in a landscape where cooperation meant survival. We do not know the answer, but we do know that the stones are real. They stand on a hill in Turkey, carved with creatures that still look out from the limestone, and they refuse to fit neatly into the story we were taught. If one hill could hold this much organized memory, it raises a sharper question. Was it alone? Or was it part of a wider forgotten horizon? A world of sacred centers that appeared before the usual machinery of civilization was ready to explain them. That is where the next trace leads. The familiar story of civilization is a ladder. First came farming, then villages, then cities, writing, and only after that the heavy stone monuments. It sounds logical. The order feels like common sense. But Göbekli Tepe reverses the steps. The monument came first, and that reversal is not a small detail. It is a crack in the simple picture of how human society became complex. The hill in southeastern Turkey does not look like a city. There are no streets, no houses, no hearths or storage pits that suggest people lived there year-round. The excavations have uncovered extraordinary carved pillars and circular enclosures, but they have not uncovered the remains of a permanent settlement. This was not a place to live. It was a place to gather. People came from far away. They came in groups, perhaps seasonally, carrying the knowledge of wild animals, the memory of ancestors, and the need to meet other human beings beyond their immediate band. And they came to do something that did not directly feed anyone. They quarried limestone. They shaped it into T-shaped pillars that could rise more than 5 meters and weigh several tons. They carved foxes, snakes, boars, and birds into the stone with careful, deliberate lines. They raised these pillars in rings, built walls, and filled the spaces between them. Then, after some time, they buried the enclosures and built new ones on top. Think of it as sacred work before daily bread. The labour was enormous. Every day spent cutting stone was a day not spent hunting, gathering, or repairing a shelter. The work required food, organisation, shared planning, and a reason strong enough to bring people back, again and again, to a place that offered no immediate material reward. And that reason was not survival. It was meaning. Something had already formed in the human world that could make such work feel necessary. A shared story, a shared calendar, a shared memory of some event, or a shared vision of something larger than the visible world. Whatever it was powerful enough to organize people before farming had fully taken hold, before villages had become towns, before kings and scribes and city walls existed to explain such effort. One site cannot prove a lost empire, but it can make the simple ladder bend. The standard story is not foolish. It explains much of what came later, but it is no longer complete. The first crack appears here, at a hill where hunter-gatherers built a temple before they built a city. Göbekli Tepe cannot carry the full weight of a lost civilization on its own, yet it shows that organized human effort, symbolic complexity, and shared sacred memory did not wait politely for cities and writing to appear. The crack is real, and if the crack is real, then the next question becomes inescapable. Was this hill alone, or was it part of a wider forgotten horizon? Because only a few dozen kilometers away, another hill called Karahan Tepe is emerging from the soil, and it carries the same strange signature. There, archaeologists have uncovered the same kinds of T-shaped pillars, the same circular enclosures, the same labour-intensive construction, and dates that place it in the same early period. This is not a single oddity. It is the beginning of a pattern. And that pattern forces a new question. If these hills were connected, what kind of world once stretched across this landscape, and how much of it is still hidden beneath the soil? Less than 50 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, another hill rises from the same dry Anatolian plain. The name is Karahan Tepe, and the first thing the eye catches is the same language carved into stone. T-shaped pillars, circular enclosures, animal reliefs worked into limestone with a steady, deliberate hand. It is not a copy of the first site, it is a neighbour, built in the same pre-ceramic window, carrying the same visual grammar. Finding one cathedral in a landscape you thought held only villages is a shock. Finding a second cathedral changes the question entirely. The first anomaly begins to look less like an exception, and more like the surviving edge of a pattern. Karahan Tepe belongs to a wider landscape that Turkish archaeologists now call Taş Tepeler, stone hills. The name is humble, but the map it covers is not. At least a dozen known sites spread across the region share the same monumental vocabulary. Pillars, benches, carved predators, birds, snakes, and the same circular gathering spaces sunk into the earth. Some are still buried, some are only partly excavated. A few have barely been touched by a trowel, but the shared language of stone keeps appearing. Another enclosure, another carved stone, another place where people returned again and again long before cities, before writing, before the standard machinery of civilization was supposed to make such work meaningful. Imagine the landscape not as a single hill of mystery, but as a network of related sacred places. Each one demanded organized labor, quarrying, shaping, moving, feeding the hands that did the work. No single site could have done this in isolation. The pattern suggests shared knowledge, shared ritual, shared authority. A world of stone that stretched across the hills, visible from one high place to the next. The most unsettling thing is not one ancient monument, it is repetition. A single site might be a fluke of ambition, a strange experiment that flickered and died. A cluster of related sites, built and rebuilt over centuries, suggests something much harder to dismiss. A shared cultural world. A horizon of belief and labour that was strong enough to hold people together for work that did not directly fill their stomachs. This is where the lost world feeling begins to grow larger than a single lucky survival. Early monumental organisation was not an accident. It left traces not in one place, but across a region. And if this pattern survives in the hills of southeastern Turkey, the question becomes inevitable. How much of this older world still lies hidden under later layers, waiting to be read? The repeated sacred horizon is exactly the kind of trace a forgotten world would leave behind. Not a city wall, not a palace, but a language of stone spoken in many voices across a landscape that later generations walked over without understanding. The first stone at Göbekli Tepe has neighbours, and those neighbours change the scale of the story. A single hill of carved stone can be explained as a lucky fluke, but when the same stone language appears again and again across a region, the story changes. The horizon of stone enclosures stretching across the Taş Tepeler landscape does not add up to a capital, a kingdom, or a unified state. But it adds up to something else. It adds up to a shared world. The T-shaped pillars, the carved foxes and birds, The circular enclosures dug into the hillsides, these are not random, they repeat. And repetition across distance means that ideas were moving, not just stones, but meanings. A repeated sacred horizon is not the same as a lost empire. It is something quieter, but perhaps more important. It is exactly the kind of surviving pattern that makes a forgotten world feel plausible. Think of what must have been true for such a pattern to exist. Different groups, spread across hills and valleys, had to share a similar vision of what a sacred place looked like. They had to be willing to travel, to carry stone, to feed workers who were not hunting or gathering. They had to trust that the effort was worth it, even if the payoff was not a full stomach or a safer shelter. This is not just religion. It is social organization at a scale that leaves marks on the land. And the marks are not chaotic. They follow rules. The enclosures at Karahan Tepe, for example, show a similar layout logic to those at Göbekli Tepe, even though they are separated by kilometers of rugged terrain. That kind of consistency does not happen by accident. It happens when people carry a shared mental template in their heads and impose it on the landscape. And when you walk the site today, you are not walking through a city. There are no streets, no granaries, no palace walls. But the absence of those familiar signs does not make the site simple. It makes the question sharper. What was strong enough to bring people together for work that did not directly keep them alive? Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was the need to mark time, to honor ancestors, to calm fears that had no other outlet. We do not know for certain. But the fact that the question can be asked at all, and asked across multiple sites, already shifts the ground. That question is exactly what we are following. The episode's title is not Looking for One Lost Kingdom. It is Looking for Lost Worlds. And a lost world can leave behind a sacred horizon as easily as it can leave behind a wall. The Taş Tepeler horizon delivers that promise in carved pillars and buried enclosures. What began as a single strange hill in southeastern Turkey now has neighbours. Karahan Tepe, Sabur, and other sites are still being uncovered, and each one makes the pattern harder to dismiss. The anomaly is not isolated. It is the visible tip of a much larger submerged iceberg of early human complexity. Land can be a generous preserver. It can keep stone arrangements intact for millennia. But land can also be a quiet thief. It can bury older surfaces under new soil, new forests. New human activity until the original shape is hidden entirely. Land can preserve networks of sacred architecture long after the people who built them are forgotten. But land can also bury them deeper. So if we have found a sacred horizon on the surface, the next question is unsettling. What other horizons might be hidden entirely beneath later layers? The next case takes us to a hill in Indonesia that refuses to stay only a hill. Gunung Padang, a place where the visible terraces and stone pillars may only be the latest skin of something much older. If hills can preserve the past, they can also swallow it. The land had its own way of hiding things. We had followed the pattern of stone across a landscape, from a single carved hill to a horizon of enclosures. But now we were about to encounter a place where the ground itself seemed unwilling to reveal its full depth. The trace was not a visible ruin standing proud on a plain. It was a green hill in Indonesia, covered in terraces of columnar jointed stones, looking less like a building and more like a shape the earth had half swallowed. The site is called Gunung Padang. At first glance, it appears to be a stepped platform, a kind of sacred terrace rising from the landscape of West Java. The surface is made of thousands of rectangular stones, laid in rows and steps, as if a giant staircase had been draped over the hill. It feels ancient, carefully placed, but not impossible. Many cultures have shaped hills into sacred places, and the visible stonework could fit comfortably within the last few thousand years. But the hill refuses to be only a hill. The reason has to do with what may lie beneath the grass, the soil, and the uppermost stones. Researchers have used ground-penetrating radar, resistivity surveys, and core drilling to peer below the surface, and they have reported something provocative: the possibility of deeper chambers, older structures, and layers of human modification that extend far below the familiar terraces. The hill, according to these studies, might not be just a hill crowned with stone. It might be a palimpsest, a manuscript written over earlier writing, each generation adding its own stone skin while the older ones sleep underneath. Think of a palimpsest the way a scribe once used it, a parchment too valuable to waste, so the old text was scraped away and a new one written on top. But the old ink never fully vanished. With the right light, the earlier words begin to show through. Gunung Padang invites exactly that kind of reading. The visible terraces are the latest layer, but the deeper echoes, if the surveys are correct, suggest that people were reshaping this hill long before the surface stones were set. The visible features alone are already compelling. The site has at least 5 terraces, each faced with long, regular stones that lock together without mortar. The stone is columnar andesite, a volcanic rock that fractures naturally into prismatic shapes, almost like nature had already started the work of making blocks. That natural tendency made the stone easier to split and stack, but the overall design is unmistakably human. The top terrace opens toward a wide view, and the whole complex feels oriented, intentional, as if the shape of the hill was not just used but answered. What makes the buried layer idea so powerful is the suggestion that the hill might contain structures or cavities that predate the terrace construction by many thousands of years. Some investigators have proposed dates that push the earliest human activity into the last ice age, far older than the usual chronology for complex stonework in the region. That claim has sparked intense debate. Many archaeologists remain unconvinced, arguing that the subsurface features could be natural formations, or that the dating methods have been misapplied. The controversy is real, and it has not been settled. But the debate itself is part of the atmosphere that keeps Gunung Padang alive as a mystery. We do not need to resolve it tonight. What matters is the image the hill plants in the mind, a place where the oldest human layers are not displayed as obvious ruins, but disguised as landscape waiting underfoot. The green skin of the hill conceals a question. How much of the past is not gone, but simply buried, wearing the ordinary face of the ground? Gunung Padang makes the buried layer idea physical. The oldest traces of human organization may not look like fallen temples or collapsed city walls. They may look like a hill you would walk over without a second thought, its deepest memory hidden inside the earth, its surface only the latest page. And once you accept that possibility, that the ground itself can become an archive, the next question becomes harder to ignore. If a single hill can hold so much hidden depth, what else might be concealed beneath other ordinary-looking landscapes, waiting for the right light to show through? The debate over Gunung Padang is real, and it is not small. Some researchers have proposed that the hill contains buried layers reaching back 20,000 years or more, making it perhaps the oldest stepped pyramid on Earth. Others see a more recent terraced site, built upon a natural volcanic hill, with dates falling comfortably within the last few thousand years. The truth is not settled, and the argument continues. But for our purpose here, the debate itself is not the most important thing. The most important thing is the stone. Walk across the terraces of Gunung Padang, and you are walking on columnar basalt, dark and angular, fitted into steps and platforms that rise up the green hillside. The stone is undeniably shaped. It has been cut, moved, arranged. Someone stood on this hill and decided to build, and someone else, later, came back and built again. This is not a single moment frozen in time. It is a place that was worked and reworked, perhaps across many centuries, perhaps across several ages. And beneath the visible terraces, geophysical surveys have detected what might be chambers, voids, and older structures hidden within the hill. The word might matters here, but the possibility is not imaginary. The hill may contain more than what the eye can see. This is where Gunung Padang becomes difficult to let go of. One can set aside the most extreme dates. One can accept that the visible stonework may not be as old as the boldest claims suggest. And still, the site does a quiet, powerful thing. It makes the viewer feel that the ground underfoot is not empty, that a hill can be an archive. Whether the oldest layer beneath Gunung Padang is 10,000 years old or 2,000, the principle remains the same. Land can swallow human effort. It can hold it in layers, like pages pressed together, with only the topmost surface visible to later eyes. This is not a strange idea. Many ancient cities are buried beneath later cities. Many temples rest upon older temples. The difference here is that the archive might not announce itself as a ruin. It might look like a green hill in West Java, with a few terraces on its slopes and a sense that something older is resting below the grass. And that is the thought that stays, not the date, the depth. The past may be underfoot, disguised as landscape, waiting. Göbekli Tepe showed us sacred organization before the expected machinery of cities. The Taş Tepeler horizon showed us that such places were not alone. They belong to a wider world of repeated stone enclosures and shared memory. And now Gunung Padang leaves us with a different kind of trace. A hill that may carry older human decisions inside itself. Like a sealed container. These three land cases have done something important together. They have shifted the question from did anything exist before the standard beginning to how much of that older world is still hidden in the land itself. The next step is to weave these threads into a single recognition, not a list, a pattern. If this mystery pulls you in, like subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The first three Lost World traces have all been on dry land, but the oldest human coastlines are not on dry land, they're underwater, and that is where the story must go next. A pillar, a pattern, a buried hill. Each one on its own could be called an anomaly. An early masterpiece of carved stone, a cluster of related enclosures, a terraced mound with something older lying beneath its visible surface. But when you place them side by side, they stop looking like isolated surprises. They start to look like pieces of something larger. Not an empire, not a single civilization with a single name, but a way of being human that left its mark across the land in forms we are only beginning to recognize. Göbekli Tepe gave us the first image. T-shaped pillars rising from a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, carved with foxes, snakes, birds, and abstract shapes, arranged in circles that required quarrying, shaping, moving and feeding workers long before the standard story expected such coordinated effort. The site does not need to be a city to matter. It matters because it preserves one thing a vanished world would leave behind. Organized sacred labor, repeated over generations, without the usual machinery of farming villages, kings and writing to explain it. Then the picture widened. Karahan Tepe and the Taş Tepeler horizon showed that Göbekli Tepe was not alone. Across the same dry uplands, other enclosures rose, other pillars were carved. Other groups returned to make meaning in stone. The repetition itself becomes the evidence. When you see the same impulse to build, the same animal forms, the same investment of human energy scattered across multiple sites, you're no longer looking at a single lucky survival. You're looking at a shared cultural world, a world that left a horizon of sacred centers behind it. And then Gunung Padang added the third dimension, depth. Here the visible terraces and columnar stones sit on a hill that may contain older layers beneath them. The scientific debate about its exact age is part of the story, but the deeper truth is simpler. The hill makes visible a possibility that applies far beyond Indonesia. The past can be underfoot without looking like a city. A green slope, a stone platform, a place that later people used and reused, may carry older human decisions hidden inside it. The landscape becomes an archive. Together, these three cases build something that no single site could carry alone. They do not prove a lost global empire. They do not hand us a name, a language, a king list. But they change the question. The question is no longer whether complex organization could exist before the familiar ladder of civilization. The question is how much of that older world still lies partly preserved, partly buried, partly disguised as ordinary hills and stone fields, waiting for the right light to reveal it. You can think of it as a hidden sacred horizon, a landscape where older patterns of belief, labor and memory are written not in books, but in stone placement, in repeated architectural forms, in the choice to build in one place and not another. Some of it is visible, some of it is buried, and some of it may never be found, not because it was never there, but because the land does not give up every secret. The standard story is not foolish. It simply looks at the clearest evidence first, cities, writing, visible monuments. But strong evidence is not the same thing as the first thing that happened. The first three Lost World cases remind us that the archive of dry land is already deeper and stranger than the simple ladder suggests, and dry land is only part of the archive, because the oldest human coastlines are no longer dry land. The sea came for them. Quietly, over thousands of years, it swallowed the shores where the earliest complex societies may have gathered. It covered camps, settlements, travel routes, and entire landscapes. What Doggerland preserves, what Atlit Yam still holds, what the memory of Dwarka keeps whispering, is the next piece of the pattern. Not buried under earth, but drowned under water. If land can hide the past, water can erase it almost completely, and that is where the search turns next. We have walked through stone enclosures and hidden hills, but now we turn to a landscape that was not buried, it was drowned. Its name sounds like a legend. Doggerland. But it is not a myth. It is a real, vanished country that once connected Britain to the European mainland. Today it lies beneath the cold, grey waters of the North Sea. To understand how a country can disappear, you have to follow the water. At the end of the last ice age, the great ice sheets that had locked up so much of the planet's water began to melt. Over thousands of years, the meltwater poured into the oceans. Sea levels rose, slowly, relentlessly, by more than 100 metres in total. The shallow continental shelves that had been dry land for tens of thousands of years were slowly swallowed. Doggerland was not a barren bridge. It was a rich, lowland world. Rivers wound through wide valleys. Marshes and wetlands stretched for miles. Forests of birch and pine covered the higher ground. Animals moved across it. Deer, wild cattle, boar, even mammoths in the colder periods, and people. For thousands of years, small bands of hunters, fishers, and gatherers lived here. They followed the herds, camped by the rivers, and left behind their tools, their bones, and the quiet traces of human life. For centuries, fishermen in the North Sea occasionally pulled up strange things in their nets: the bones of land animals, ancient stone tools, even human remains. At first, these were curiosities, but over time, they became the scattered evidence of a lost world: a mammoth tooth dragged from the seabed, a barbed antler point, a fragment of a human skull. Each one was a piece of a map that had been erased. The water did not simply cover a piece of land, it erased a whole inhabited country. The coastlines where the earliest complex human societies might have grown, the places where people first gathered in larger numbers, where they traded, where they built their first permanent settlements along the shore, those coastlines are now deep underwater. The oldest chapters of human life by the sea are gone, not because they never existed, but because the archive itself was submerged. Doggerland turns the idea of a great flood from a story into a geological fact. Water is not only a symbol of catastrophe and a myth, it is a real mechanism that can erase entire human landscapes from the visible record. And if one such landscape can vanish beneath the North Sea, then the absence of early coastal evidence everywhere else is not a comforting sign that nothing was there. It is a warning that the first archive of complex coastal life may be lying under the waves, waiting. In the next part, we will look closer at the things the fishermen pulled up, the bones and tools that are the only remaining pieces of that drowned world, and ask what they tell us about the people who walked there, long before the water came. The traces do not come from legends, they come from the seabed itself. Fishing boats working the North Sea have dragged up more than fish. Over the decades, their nets have pulled in the bones of mammoths, the antlers of giant deer, flint tools shaped by human hands, and even a fragment of a human skull. These are not shipwreck survivors. They are pieces of a world that once stood above water. The mammoth bones tell you the climate was cold and the land was wide. The flint tools tell you people moved across it, hunting, camping, following rivers that no longer exist. The skull fragment tells you they died there, and their remains sank slowly into the peat, then deeper still as the sea rose and covered everything. For a long time, these finds felt disconnected, random gifts from the ocean floor. But the seabed itself was keeping a secret. When scientists began to map the underwater contours with seismic equipment, the scattered bones suddenly belonged to a map. They were not lost. They were exactly where the old rivers, hills and wetlands used to be. The seismic data is not complicated. Sound waves sent down through the water bounce off layers of sediment and buried rock. The echoes return a picture of a drowned landscape, a valley, a ridge, a lake bed, a coastline now invisible. Silt samples pulled from the bottom contain pollen from ancient forests, traces of freshwater plants, and the microscopic shells of land snails. The ground under the North Sea is not a featureless plain. It is a country that has been quietly covered over. This is where the story begins to shift from geography into something closer to a lost archive. If a landscape this large, this rich in human life, can vanish completely under ordinary sea level change, then the absence of early coastal evidence is no longer a mystery. It is a geological certainty. The coastlines where early people gathered food, built shelters, and left their oldest marks were exactly the places the rising water came for first. The implication is not subtle. It sits at the centre of every flood story ever told. The most complex human societies of the deep past may not have lived on inland plateaus or in mountain caves. They may have lived where the resources were richest, where the climate was mildest, where travel and trade followed the water. They may have lived along coastlines that are now deep underwater. Their remains are not missing because they never existed. They are missing because the places they occupied are no longer dry land. Doggerland turns an abstract worry into a physical fact. The first archive of complex human life may have been placed exactly where the sea later came. What we see on land is not the whole record. It is only the surviving surface. But a drowned landscape is one thing. A landscape can lose its rivers and hills and still leave only scattered bones and stone tools. What happens when the sea preserves something more complete? Something with walls and floors and the unmistakable shape of a human settlement? The next case answers that question not with dredged fragments, but with a village that still rests beneath the Mediterranean, its houses and burials waiting in the quiet dark. Off the coast of Israel, about 10 meters below the surface of the Mediterranean, a village rests on the seabed. Its stone walls still stand. A well, carved into the rock, still holds fresh water, and around it, the remains of people who once lived there, buried with care, their bodies arranged in simple graves. The site is called Atlit Yam. It is not a ruin of temples or palaces. It is a domestic world. Houses, hearths, storage pits, a stone circle, the bones of fish and domesticated animals. It was a place where families drew water, prepared food, mourned their dead, and looked out at a shoreline that no longer exists. The sea they watched was not yet at their door. It was still retreating from the last ice age, slowly melting, slowly rising, a few millimeters a year, a few centimeters in a generation. Enough that over centuries the waterline crept closer. Eventually it swallowed the village whole. Today, divers can swim over the same stone walls that once defined a household. They can see the well that still gives fresh water, and the circular stone setting that may have been a ritual space. They can see the burials, some individuals laid in flexed positions, one buried with a stone slab over the body, another with a dog. These are not artifacts in a museum case. They are the intimate traces of human life that the sea preserved, because it covered them gently and completely. What makes Atlit Yam so powerful is not its age alone. It dates to around the 7th millennium before Christ, roughly 8,000 years ago, but its ordinariness. It is not a mythic city. It is not a legend of a drowned kingdom. It is a real settlement, with the same daily rhythms as any coastal village today. And the mechanism that claimed it is equally real: post-glacial sea level rise, the same process that drowned Doggerland and that flooded every continental shelf on the planet, took this village and turned it into an underwater archive. The difference between Atlit Yam and Doggerland is the texture of survival. Doggerland gave us bones and tools dredged from the seafloor, a lost country we could map but not walk through. Atlit Yam gives us walls, floors and burials. It gives us a well that still holds water. It gives us the feeling that the people who lived here are not abstract ancestors, but individuals who once had names, who once stood on dry ground and felt the ground grow wetter over their lifetimes. This is not a legend. It is not a matter of belief. It is a documented archaeological site, and that changes the question. It is no longer, could human settlements be underwater? They are. The question becomes, how many older ones lie beyond easy reach, in deeper water, on older coastlines that were submerged thousands of years before Atlit Yam even existed? The sea has been rising for more than 10,000 years. Every coastline that was inhabited before that rise now sits under tens or hundreds of meters of water. The oldest coastal settlements, the ones that might tell us about the earliest experiments with fishing, sea travel, or permanent seaside life, are probably deeper still, buried in sediment, invisible to any simple survey. Atlit Yam proves a smaller but crucial point. Human worlds can pass below the waterline and survive only as fragments on the seabed. One village does not make a lost civilization, but it makes the missing coastal archive physically real. It turns the absence of early coastal evidence from an abstract problem into a concrete loss, and it makes the stories of drowned cities, of places remembered only because the sea took them, feel less like fantasy and more like a possible memory of similar losses. But a single village is only a glimpse. The deeper story is what this loss means for our picture of the past, and how it makes later underwater mysteries, like the sacred city of Dwarka, remembered as swallowed by the sea, feel less like fantasy and more like a possible memory of similar losses. The well at Atlit Yam was not dug in a panic. It was cut into the ground deliberately, lined with stone, and used for years. Fresh water is not an afterthought. It is a reason to stay, a reason to return, a reason to build a life in a place. So when archaeologists found that well under the Mediterranean, it told them something quiet but absolute. People were not just passing through, they were living. The slow drowning of Atlit Yam was not a single catastrophe. It was a shoreline that moved a little every generation. A family would notice the sea coming closer, but not enough to leave. A grandfather might remember an old path that had since become marsh. A mother might plant a garden slightly higher up the slope. Over centuries, the water rose roughly 1 to 2 meters every 100 years, a pace that allowed for adaptation, not instant flight. But eventually the village that had once stood on dry ground became untenable. The well filled with salt, the houses flooded, the dead could no longer be buried above the waterline, and the people moved inland, carrying only what could be carried, leaving the stone foundations to the sea. This slow-motion loss is not unique. After the last ice age, sea levels rose globally by over 120 meters. Almost every coastline that existed at the height of the ice age is now underwater. The map of the world that early humans knew, the lowlands of Southeast Asia, the shallow shelves off Florida, the vast plains that connected Siberia to Alaska, all of it vanished. Atlit Yam survived in a recognizable form only because it was built partly of stone, and because it lay in a bay where currents did not immediately tear it apart. Most other settlements from that time would have been made of wood, mud, bone, and memory. They left no stone wells, they left no trace at all, and this is where the site becomes more than a single village. It becomes a lens. If one small community off the coast of Israel could be preserved and later rediscovered, it suggests that thousands of others were not. The earliest chapters of human settlement, the places where people first learned to fish the sea, to navigate the shore, to build permanent homes near the water, those chapters are mostly missing. Not because they never existed, but because the sea took them. The archaeological record, the familiar ladder of civilization, was built largely on evidence from dry land, from caves and inland valleys and river terraces. But the richest, most stable environments for early complex societies may well have been the coastlines that are now submerged. We have been reading a history written by survivors of geography, not by those who lived closest to the sea. Atlit Yam does not prove a lost high civilization. It does not need to. What it proves is something more fundamental, that human worlds really can pass beneath the waterline and survive only as fragments on the seabed. It gives the submerged past a human face, a well, a burial, a stone circle, a house, and it makes the larger, more disputed underwater cases harder to dismiss out of hand. If a simple village could be lost and found, what about a city remembered in sacred stories? The sea may have erased the stone, but not always the memory. After the silent stones of Atlit Yam, we turn to a place where stone and story meet, a city remembered not just as great, but as taken by the sea. In one of the oldest epics of India, the Mahabharata, there is a passage about a golden city built by the divine figure Krishna. It stood on the coast, glittering with palaces and gardens. But when Krishna left the mortal world, the story says, the sea rose and swallowed the city whole. The waves closed over the gates and the towers, and Dwarka became a memory carried by the water. A myth like this is not a photograph. It is not a precise recording of dates and dimensions. But it can function as a memory vessel, a container that preserves the shape of a real event, even as time distorts the details. A city that vanished beneath the sea is exactly the kind of event that could survive for centuries in story form, long after the physical ruins were lost. And then, in the shallow waters off the modern coast of Dwarka in Gujarat, divers and marine archaeologists began to find something unexpected. Stone walls, stone anchors, pottery fragments, the remains of what looked like an ancient port submerged under the Arabian Sea. The finds are not a perfect match for the golden city of legend, and scholars debate their exact age and function. But the overlap is striking. A sacred tradition speaks of a drowned city, and in the same general location, underwater stone structures and harbour artefacts have been recovered. The meeting point between story and physical trace is no longer empty. Earlier in this journey, we saw how Doggerland and Atlit Yam made one thing clear. The sea is a powerful eraser of human worlds. Entire landscapes and settlements can slip below the waterline, leaving only fragments behind. Dwarka adds a new layer to that recognition. Here, the sea did not only take a place, it also left a story. The memory of the drowning survived in sacred words, passed down through generations. That shifts the question. It is no longer simply, did a real city exist here? The underwater traces suggest that something did. The question becomes more subtle. Could a real coastal settlement, perhaps a thriving port, have been overwhelmed by the sea so dramatically that it burned itself into cultural memory? And if so, how much of that memory is distorted, and how much carries a kernel of actual geography and loss? This is where Dwarka's power really lies. It does not require us to believe that every golden tower from the epic was real. It only requires us to notice that a tradition of a drowned sacred city has clung to a specific stretch of coastline for thousands of years, and that physical remains now exist under that same water. The story and the stones are not identical, but they overlap in a way that is difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. A myth, then, is not a broken record. It may be a vessel that carries the emotional truth of a catastrophe long after the exact facts have faded. The sea erased the city. The story remembered the erasure. And today, fragments of stone and clay lie on the seabed, quietly confirming that something was indeed lost here. But to treat myth as only a broken record is to miss its power as a vessel. The next trace asks how much memory can survive when water is not the eraser, but the very ground the city was built upon. But the memory of Dwarka did not sink with its stones. It lived on in story. In the ancient Indian epic, the Mahabharata, Dwarka is described as a city of breathtaking beauty, a place of gardens and temples, built where the land met the sea. It was the seat of Krishna, a divine king, a city so rich that later generations spoke of it with longing. And the story tells how, after Krishna departed the world, the sea rose and swallowed the city whole. It was not a slow fading, but a claiming. The water took it back. That is not a geological report, but it is something else. It is a memory vessel. A myth is not a lab record. But it can preserve the shape of a catastrophe. The fear, the awe, the sense that a world ended and a new one began. When a story says the sea took the city, it may not give you the year or the precise shoreline, but it hands you an emotional truth. A place, once alive, is now underwater. That feeling, carried through generations, is itself a kind of archive. The question is not whether the Mahabharata is literal history in every detail. The question is whether the story holds a kernel of real loss, and Dwarka is not alone. Around the world, ancient traditions speak of great floods that cleansed the earth, that drowned proud cities, that separated the time of before from the time of after. Sumerian, Greek, Mesopotamian, Mesoamerican, the stories echo. Most are not exact records of a single global event, but many are rooted in landscapes that really did flood, in coastlines that really did retreat, in settlements that really did vanish beneath the sea. The last great rise of the oceans after the Ice Age was slow, but its effects would have been unforgettable. Year after year the shore crept inward, swallowing familiar landmarks, forcing people to move, to remember, to tell their children why they no longer lived where their grandparents had lived. Dwarka sits at a powerful intersection. On one side, the physical traces, underwater stone, possible walls, anchors, the remains of a port. On the other, the story, a sacred city, a divine departure, a sea that took everything. We cannot line up the stones with the verses and say, this was Krishna's gate. The evidence is too fragmented, the water too deep, time too long. But the overlap is not nothing. It is a rare case where tradition, archaeology, and memory meet in the same shallow bay. To dismiss the myth as mere invention is to ignore that people do not easily invent a drowned home. They remember it, and they turn the loss into a story that can survive the water. This is the turn. If a city is taken by the sea, its streets may vanish, but its name can travel. The memory becomes a second archive, a parallel record that outlasts the very stones it describes. The myth is not a lie. It is the shape of the loss, pressed into language and handed forward. And when we later find submerged stone that aligns with the memory, we're not proving a story. We are watching two different types of evidence, stone and story, whisper the same thing: something was here, and the water came. So Dwarka does not need to be a miracle of ancient engineering. It is stronger as a memory that refused to drown. The Mahabharata gave it a sacred frame, a divine tragedy. But the core might be simpler: a real coastal city, a real rising sea, a real disappearance. The myth kept the city alive long after the water closed over it. Water can erase stone, but not always story. Dwarka is the proof of that persistence. In the bay, the blocks lie silent. In the epic, the city still gleams. And somewhere between the two, a lost world waits to be remembered. Now, after 3 water cases, the pattern becomes clear. The sea has been a great eraser, but also a preserver of memory. It is time to step back and see how water reshapes our entire picture of the past. Before we leave the water, we need to look again at the 3 images we have collected. The first is a map of Doggerland, a country of rivers, marshes, and low hills that once connected Britain to Europe. Now it rests beneath the North Sea, its surface known only through bones and stone tools pulled up by fishing nets. The second is a stone well in the Mediterranean, part of a village called Atlit Yam. Around it, houses, burials, and a circle of stones. People drew fresh water there and watched a shoreline that no longer exists. The third is a wall under the Arabian Sea, near the coast of modern India. The tradition calls it Dwarka, a sacred city swallowed by the sea. Beneath the waves, divers have found stone blocks and anchors, though the lines between legend and physical ruin remain blurred. 3 images, 3 different losses. And now we need to see them not as separate stories, but as one argument. Water is not a simple eraser. It hides landscapes, but it can also protect what it covers. Wood, bone, the shape of a settlement, better than dry earth. So the sea becomes both destroyer and accidental preserver. It takes a world, then freezes part of it in a quiet underwater archive. The rising sea after the last ice age did not strike in one terrible day. It crept, century after century, swallowing coastlines and forcing people to move inland or perish. But if you step back and look at the whole planet, the effect was a slow flood that erased entire human landscapes. Doggerland shows the scale. An inhabited territory the size of a country disappeared beneath the waves. Atlit Yam shows the human detail, a place where people lived, drew water, and buried their dead before the sea took their village. Dwarka shows how such drownings can enter memory. The sacred story of a city swallowed by the sea may preserve the shape of a real loss long after exact names and dates have changed. Together they make one cumulative point. The water did not only exist in myth, it physically reshaped the human map. If the oldest, most complex settlements were built along rich coastlines, where fish, travel routes, and fertile wetlands offered the best conditions, then those are exactly the places the sea later claimed. The earliest chapters of human organisation may now lie under tens of metres of water, hidden from standard archaeology. This connects back to the earlier land cases, on dry ground. We saw sacred centres buried by time and soil. Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, the possible older layers inside Gunung Padang. The earth buried them, the sea erased the coastlines. Both mechanisms hide older human worlds. But the pattern is now clearer. The standard timeline of civilization is built largely on what survived on dry land. It is a dry land history, and that means the absence of evidence for earlier coastal cultures is not reassuring. It is geology. This does not prove a specific lost empire or a single worldwide flood, but it makes the lost world thesis harder to dismiss. If water took the earliest coastal settlements, then what we see inland may be later, more marginal survivors, cultures that moved away from the coasts carrying memories of a drowned world. A pre-flood human landscape becomes not a fantasy, but a logical possibility. The search for lost civilizations now includes a missing archive under the sea, but some things the water could not touch. The next traces are stones that remained above the waves, carrying their own lost language, a language of repetition and weight. We have moved from water back to stone. The sea erased coastlines, swallowed settlements, and left only fragments of memory above the waves. but some traces stayed above water, their language carved into rock so hard that it still raises questions today. And few places carry that language more sharply than a scattering of blocks high in the Andes, near the shores of Lake Titicaca. The site is called Puma Punku. It sits at an altitude where the air is thin and the stone is volcanic andesite, a material that resists ordinary shaping. What catches the eye first is not the size of the stones, though they are heavy. It is the forms, H-shaped blocks, recessed planes, sharp internal angles, grooves and channels that run straight and true. The blocks look less like rubble and more like pieces from a larger system, a kind of stone grammar whose rules are no longer remembered. To say that the stonework shows repetition is not to describe a simple pattern. It is to say that the same precise shapes appear again and again across different blocks, as if someone were following a design that could be reproduced. A recessed step, a clean right angle, a flat surface that meets another flat surface without a hand's width gap. The stone does not look randomly cut. It looks planned, disciplined, almost modular. Now, the standard explanation places Puma Punku within the Tiwanaku culture, a civilization that flourished in the region between roughly 500 and 1,000 years after Christ. The Tiwanaku builders are known to have worked stone on a large scale, and their influence spread across the highlands. There is no need to deny their role to appreciate the strange power of what remains. The accepted history answers part of the picture. It provides names, a timeline, a cultural context. But the accepted history does not fully dissolve the question that floats above these scattered forms. The question is not whether human hands shaped the stones. It is what kind of knowledge, what training, what inherited craft allowed those hands to produce such consistency in such an unyielding material. When you look at an H-block, you're not looking at a natural shape. You're looking at a decision repeated in stone, a design that someone carried in their mind, taught to others, and imposed on rock that does not give way easily. At this point, a careful viewer might ask, could this not be explained by patience, by abrasive sand, by generations of practice? And the answer is yes, in part. Human ingenuity is vast, and the past is full of achievements that modern assumptions once dismissed as impossible. But that very patience and practice only deepen the mystery. They imply a society that could afford to spend enormous time on non-survival labour. They imply a transmission of technical knowledge stable enough to produce the same forms over and over. They imply a motive strong enough to justify the cost. And that is where the lost world feeling begins to gather. Puma Punku does not need to be proof of lost super technology to unsettle the modern eye. It unsettles because the design logic is visible, but the design knowledge is gone. We can see the grammar, but we cannot read the sentences. The stones are like a script carved into a language that nobody speaks anymore. The shapes are there, the repetition is there, the discipline is there. What is missing is the living tradition that would make sense of it all. That is a different kind of loss than a drowned coastline. It is not physical erasure by water, it is cultural erasure by time, a craft knowledge that vanished, a way of thinking about stone that later generations inherited as ruins, not as instructions. The Tiwanaku themselves may have been inheritors of an older tradition, or they may have developed it to a peak and then lost it. The stones do not say. They only show the result. What remains powerful is that the result still looks startling, not because it defies physics, but because it defies the simple story of gradual improvisational progress. The blocks at Puma Punku feel like they belong to a world where stone was not just a material to be stacked, but a medium to be shaped according to shared rules. And when the rules are forgotten, the shapes become a puzzle. The real wonder is not impossible machining, it is a craft knowledge that vanished while its stone grammar remained. The next question is not how they cut the stone, but what kind of world produces such disciplined, repeated forms, and how much of that world can be lost even when the stones survive. Look at the stones of Puma Punku now, not as a single ruined wall, but as a set of repeated forms. The site lies in the thin air of the Bolivian highlands, near the older centre of Tiwanaku, but the blocks that stop the eye are the ones that look cut for a purpose no later builder fully explained. They are known as the H-blocks, and they carry the same angles, the same grooves, the same recesses again and again, as if someone had stamped a pattern into hard volcanic stone and then walked away. Think of a craftsman's signature, A potter who turns a rim the same way every time, a carpenter who always cuts a joint at the same angle, a stonemason whose chisel leaves a recognizable rhythm. At Puma Punku, that signature appears not once but across dozens of blocks. The hand is invisible, but the rules feel present. The same template seems to have guided the work, a mental blueprint that turned raw anesite into something closer to a language of shape. The obvious question is how? Copper tools, abrasives, patient labour. Perhaps wet sand and leather straps. These are the explanations that keep the site inside the reach of known history. And they are not weak explanations. Human beings have moved heavy things and carved hard stone for a very long time. But the consistency here pushes against simple improvisation. A few rough blocks can be explained by trial and error. A whole site of blocks that repeat the same complex geometry suggests a disciplined craft tradition, a system of knowledge that had already learned what worked and had already taught it to many hands. The real puzzle is not the cutting alone. The real puzzle is the loss. Somewhere between the people who planned these forms and the later world that rediscovered the site, the system that produced them disappeared. The stones survived, but the training, the rules, the memory of how and why, that did not carry forward intact. When the Inca builders arrived centuries later and saw the ruins, they saw something they admired but did not claim as their own invention. They built on top of it, around it, but the older stone language remained just below their feet, already half unreadable. Some modern claims push the mystery into numbers that are hard to verify. You will hear talk of tolerances measured in microns, of machine-like flatness that seems to belong to a later century. This episode will not rest its weight on those numbers, because the visible evidence is already unsettling enough. You do not need a laser measurement to see that the blocks fit with an attention that goes far beyond necessity. You can see it in the straight lines, the identical notches, the way a heavy piece of stone behaves as though it was shaped for a system. So the question shifts. The question is no longer only how they cut the stone. It becomes, what kind of society produces such disciplined, repeated forms? And why did the knowledge that made them disappear? While the stones themselves were left behind like a grammar without a teacher. Technology can vanish while its stone grammar remains. Puma Punku is a message carved by a world that no longer speaks. The letters are clear, but the sentence may never be fully read. But if Puma Punku is about repeated form, the next case is about weight so large it changes the scale of the question entirely. We move from the precision of the Andes to the sheer mass of Baalbek. From the precise repeating forms of Puma Punku, we now turn to a site where the wonder is not precision but sheer, overwhelming weight. In the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, the ruins of Baalbek rise on a platform of stone that stops the eye. At the base of the Temple of Jupiter, 3 enormous blocks lie fitted together. They are known as the Trilithon. Each one is over 19 meters long, more than 4 meters high, and nearly 4 meters thick. Together, they weigh an estimated 800 tons apiece. 800 tons is a number that passes through the ear too easily. It helps to pause on what that weight means in human terms. If you gather 1,000 people, each one pulling with the strength of their whole body, they might move a single heavy object over flat ground, inch by inch. Now multiply that effort. To quarry, lift and position a stone of this size without engines, without steel cables, without modern roadways, requires not only muscle but an almost unthinkable coordination of time, tools and will. Every day spent on that stone was a day not spent growing food, not spent building shelter, not spent defending a village. Something had to make that cost acceptable. The quarry lies less than a kilometre away, but the ground rises gently. To drag an 800-ton block up that slope, across uneven terrain, and then set it precisely into a wall, demanded a system of rollers, ramps, ropes, and human bodies that we can imagine but still struggle to fully reconstruct. And yet, the Trilithon is not even the most ambitious stone in the area. In the same quarry, a block called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman still rests where it was cut. It weighs around 1,000 tons. Another, even larger, was discovered more recently, still partially attached to the bedrock. The people who worked this site imagined stones that would dwarf the ones they finally placed. That fact alone changes the question. This was not a single lucky effort. It was a culture that repeatedly tried to work at a scale beyond ordinary need. The Romans, who built the temple above these stones, were master engineers. They moved heavy objects, raised aqueducts, and constructed vast public spaces. But the blocks at Baalbek are outliers. They are larger than any other known stones in the Roman world. They sit at the base, as if the entire later temple was designed to rest on something older and heavier. The standard explanation says the Romans themselves placed them, perhaps as a show of imperial power. That may be correct. But the sheer excess of the scale keeps raising a different question. Why? Why choose stones that would test the limits of any civilization? A temple does not need an 800-ton foundation to stand. A smaller, more manageable block would have carried the same weight. So the motive was not purely practical. It was something else. Perhaps the stones were meant to overwhelm, to make the visitor feel small before the gods. Perhaps they were an inheritance, an older sacred platform that later builders could not bring themselves to dismantle. Perhaps the act of moving them was itself a message about the power of the builders, a display that went far beyond function. Whatever the reason, the foundation remains. It has outlasted the empires that worshipped there. The priests who climbed its steps, the armies that marched through the valley, and the names of the people who first dreamed of cutting stone at this scale. Later, architecture could not erase it. The columns and arches of the Roman temple sit on top of it, framed by it, as if the later builders were standing on the shoulders of a different ambition. The story is not only about how they moved them, but what it means to inherit such a foundation. On top of those stones, Roman builders later placed a temple to Jupiter. The white columns and carved pediment still rise above the darker, rougher blocks, a visible layering of history. The upper structure belongs to an empire we think we know. The lower platform belongs to a question. This is not unusual. Across the ancient world, later cultures often built upon older sacred sites, repurposing the ground and sometimes the very stones. The new temple, church, or palace claimed continuity with whatever power was already felt in that place. But it also inherited something harder to name, a sense of unfinished business, a foundation that was never fully explained. The Romans who worked at Baalbek were not primitive. They moved enormous weights, they cut precise stone, they built across continents. Yet the scale of the platform beneath their temple still raises the possibility that they were not the first to consider this ground sacred. Some researchers suggest the massive podium may have been begun earlier, perhaps by Phoenician builders who already recognized the site's significance. The evidence is not conclusive, and the dating remains debated. What is visible, though, is a choice. Whoever placed those stones chose a size that exceeded any obvious practical need. They were not simply building a base. They were making a statement about the importance of what would stand upon it. If the Romans found an older sacred platform here, they did what many empires did. They built over it, matching its ambition with their own. If they constructed everything themselves, they were still answering the same call. A place already charged with meaning, demanding a response in stone. In either case, the scale is a dialogue between ages, not a single declaration. This is the pattern of inheritance. Later people stand on the work of earlier people, often without fully understanding why the original builders chose such weight, such alignment, such impossible effort. The new temple speaks a language the builders understood. The old foundation speaks a language they may have only guessed at. And so, the site becomes a stacked archive. One layer of meaning visible and legible, another layer older, heavier, and more silent. That silence is not empty. It holds the possibility that the bottom layer was already a response to something even older, now completely gone. Wood rots, inscriptions erode, names dissolve. But the stone remains, carrying its mystery upward through every later construction. The Romans could place their Jupiter on the platform. Later generations could add a church, a fortress, a tourist path. None of them could fully erase the question sleeping in the foundation. What survives is not a single building, but the relationship between layers. The top block cannot explain the bottom block, and the bottom block cannot speak for itself. Between them is the gap where memory should be. History often looks like this. Not a clean line of progress, but a stack of decisions made on top of older decisions that are already fading from view. Baalbek makes that layering physical. You can stand beneath the Roman arch and look down at stones that seem to belong to a different order of effort. You can feel the weight of a question that later builders chose not to answer, perhaps because they could not. The past survives not as a single story, but as a series of inheritances. Each age takes what it finds and adds its own layer of meaning. The deepest layer, the one closest to the earth, holds the most difficult questions. It asks not only who built it, but what they believed, what they feared, and why they needed the stone to be so heavy. The later layers can only guess. From a continental foundation, we move to an oceanic city where the problem is not only weight, but distance and water. The next case takes us to a remote reef in the Pacific. From the stacked stones of Baalbek, we journey to a place where the stones are not just heavy, but surrounded by water. A city built on coral and memory. Off the coast of Pohnpei in the western Pacific, black basalt columns rise from a shallow lagoon. They form walls, platforms, and artificial islets, arranged across more than 92 man-made islands. Canals run between them like streets. The whole complex is called Nan Madol. The first thing to understand is the material. Those columns are not small. Some reach several meters in length and weigh many tons. They were quarried from volcanic outcrops on the far side of the main island. Then they were moved across water, through a reef environment, and stacked into precise interlocking structures. No mortar, no wheels, no draft animals. Every stone had to be loaded onto rafts or canoes, floated across the lagoon, and lifted into place on an artificial islet that was itself built from coral rubble and basalt. The sheer logistical effort is hard to overstate. It is not one heavy block. It is thousands of them, transported and arranged across a watery landscape where dry land had to be created first. Nan Madol served as a ceremonial and political centre for the Stonework dynasty, a ruling elite that controlled the island for centuries. The site contains tombs, temples, and elite residences. Oral histories on Pohnpei describe the construction in terms of magic, stones flying through the air placed by sorcerers. Those stories are not literal engineering manuals, they are cultural memory. They encode the feeling that something extraordinary happened here, something that later generations struggled to explain in ordinary language. The scale is startling. Some walls rise more than 7 meters high. The largest blocks weigh an estimated 50 tons, and all of this sits on coral islets that were built up from the lagoon floor. The builders did not simply build on existing land. They made the land. This is the hard question. Not whether human hands could move the stones. They clearly could. But why choose this place? Why invest so much labour in a reef environment, exposed to storms and salt water, when solid ground was available nearby? What made this lagoon so important that it justified the creation of a stone city on a foundation of coral? The standard answer points to political control and ritual authority. A remote, defended, awe-inspiring centre can project power. It can separate rulers from the common population. It can serve as a gateway to the spirit world. That explanation makes sense. It just does not shrink the achievement. The Stonework dynasty built something that still feels impossible, not because of lost physics, but because of the sheer human cost and the stubbornness of the location. Nan Madol expands the Lost World pattern in a new direction. It shows that monumental stonework, complex logistics, and organised authority did not belong only to dry continental empires. They appeared on remote islands, in the middle of the ocean, shaped by water rather than standing apart from it. The builders left no written records of their own. Their motivations survive only in oral traditions, in the stones themselves, and in the quiet canals that still run between the walls. What we see now is a ruin slowly returning to the lagoon. Vegetation covers some islets. Mangroves push through the basalt. But the structure remains, and with it, a question that will not sink. Why build here, of all places? And what did this city mean to the people who called it home? The answer may lie in the oral traditions and the political power that such a place embodied. The city rose from the reef on the island of Pohnpei. Black basalt columns, stacked like giant logs, formed artificial islets separated by canals. Water moved through the centre of power like streets. The stone came from quarries on the far side of the island. Each column weighed several tons. Moving them across the reef meant lifting, floating, and placing them with a precision that still puzzles engineers. The scale of the work was not small. Over 90 islets, some rising several meters above the coral, arranged in a plan that covered more than a square kilometre of lagoon. Local oral history does not speak of a lost super race. It speaks of a dynasty, the Stonework, who ruled from Nan Madol, and of a system of tribute that brought basalt from across Pohnpei. The story remembers human effort, not magic. But the effort itself is the mystery. What kind of authority could organise such labour in a remote island environment, generation after generation, without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals. So the question is not whether giants or levitation built Nan Madol. It is why a society would repeatedly choose to move stone on this scale across open water. The answer points to something we often forget, that power and belief can turn even the most difficult landscape into a sacred centre. The reef was not a barrier, it was part of the design. The canals were not just for drainage, they separated the sacred from the ordinary, the ruling dead from the living. The stone was not useful in any agricultural sense. It was a statement carved in basalt, that authority could command the sea itself. Nan Madol reminds us that lost worlds do not need to be continental. A civilization can be maritime, built on coral and memory. Its traces are not thick walls on a fertile plain, but stone islets rising from a lagoon, easily missed by ships that pass too quickly. The ocean hides not only drowned cities, but also those that were built to float above it, using the sea as a moat and a highway. Complexity does not require a continent. It can organize itself on the edge between water and sky, and leave behind a grammar of stone that survives long after the wood, the thatch, and the oral traditions have dissolved. From a city built on coral and memory, we now turn to a small clay object that carries an even older memory. It is a record of kings who ruled before the flood, and a single line that divides time in two. The Sumerian King List does not describe a physical ruin. It describes a world that ended, and a world that began again. From the stone grammar of Nan Madol, we now turn to a different kind of survival. A small clay record that preserves an even older memory. A world before the waters. In a museum case, under soft light, sits a clay prism no larger than a hand. Its surface is covered with tiny wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay over 4,000 years ago. This is cuneiform, the earliest writing system we know. And this particular object is not a modern theory, not a recent reconstruction. It is an ancient document. Its own culture treated it as a record of real kingship. The prism lists kings who ruled before the flood. Their reigns stretch into tens of thousands of years, numbers so large they feel more like myth than history. Then a single line cuts the record in two. The flood swept over. After that line, kingship descends again, but now the reigns are shorter, more human. The world after the waters is different. Most of us learn that civilization begins with the first cities, the first writing, the first kings. Sumer, we are told, is where history becomes visible. But this list was written by the Sumerians themselves, and it does not claim to be the beginning. It claims to be a continuation, something after. It says plainly that there was a world before the flood, and that world had kings, and that world ended. We are not treating these long reigns as literal biology. 10,000 years of rule is not a medical claim. It is a memory structure, a way of saying that the before was larger, stranger, farther from ordinary time. The numbers are not a lie. They are a shape, a container for a feeling that the world before the flood was not like the world after. Why would the first literate civilization, the culture that invented writing, remember a before and an after? Unless something real had fractured their world. Unless the people who first pressed marks into clay were not the first to organize, to build, to hold memory across generations. Unless the flood was not only a story but a scar. The Sumerian King List becomes the final piece of this episode's puzzle. Not a ruin of stone, not a drowned landscape, but a written voice from antiquity that does not claim to be the beginning. It claims to be something after. It records a world before the waters, and then a world after, as if civilization was already a second edition. But the list is more than a catalogue of names. It is a memory structure that asks what it means when a civilization writes down a flood that separates two orders of time. What was lost that felt so large? And why did so many other cultures, in so many other places, remember a similar dividing line? The King List's long reigns are not the strangest part. The strangest part is the line that cuts the list in two. The flood swept over. After that line, kingship descends again from heaven, and the reigns become shorter, more human, more like the numbers we expect from recorded history. The text does not explain the flood. It does not describe the waters, the survivors, or the ark. It simply states that a boundary exists. Before it, one kind of world. After it, another. Those impossible reigns, 8 kings ruling for tens of thousands of years, are often called myth. and in a literal sense they cannot be human lifespans. But the word myth does not have to mean false, it can mean memory compressed into a different shape. A reign of 36,000 years may not be a biological fact, but it may be a way of saying that the world before the flood was older, stranger, and measured by a different scale. It may preserve the names of dynasties, not individuals. It may carry the weight of a time when the boundary between gods and rulers felt thinner, and the past stretched back into a darkness that later people could no longer reach. This is not a lab report. It is a memory structure, and like many memory structures, it may preserve the shape of a real fracture long after the exact details have blurred. The Sumerians were not alone in remembering a world before a great water. The Mesopotamian traditions contain the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of Utnapishtim, who survived a flood sent by the gods. The Hebrew Bible preserves the story of Noah. Greek memory held the flood of Deucalion. Indian tradition remembers Manu, warned by a fish, building a vessel to survive the coming waters. Mesoamerican narratives speak of a previous world destroyed by a great flood. The names change, the details diverge, but the structure repeats: a world before, a catastrophe of water, a remnant, and a world after. This does not mean all these stories describe the same event with journalistic precision. It means something quieter and harder to dismiss. It means that the image of a flood that divides time is not a local accident. It is one of the most widespread motifs in human memory, and the Sumerian King List is among the oldest written versions of that motif. The shift is this. We stop asking whether a single global flood happened exactly as one text describes it. Instead, we ask why early civilizations so often remember a before that was different, larger, stranger, closer to gods or giants, and then cut off by water. The King List does not need to be literal chronology to be powerful. It does not need to be a weather report to carry weight. Its power lies in what it claims, that civilization did not begin where our clear records begin. It began earlier, in a world that was lost, and the first thing the survivors did when they rebuilt was write down the names of what came before. And when this ancient memory is placed after the stones of Göbekli Tepe, the drowned coast of Doggerland, the submerged houses of Atlit Yam, the mythic city of Dwarka, and the heavy foundations of Baalbek, it stops being just a myth. It becomes the voice that names the pattern. And now, with the King List in hand, the 9 physical cases we have walked through begin to speak with one voice. It is the 10th trace, the final object of this global tour. A small clay prism covered in wedge-shaped marks, and inside those marks a single dividing line, the flood swept over. Before that line, kings ruled for spans that break ordinary time. After it, kingship descended again from heaven, but the world had changed. The record does not present Sumer as the beginning. It presents Sumer as what came after, and that subtle claim is what draws the other 9 cases together. Think back to the sacred centre at Göbekli Tepe, where carved stone pillars rose before cities, before the full machinery of civilization was supposed to explain such labour. The King List does not mention that hill, but it carries the same quiet message. Organised human worlds existed earlier than the clean ladder of progress would lead us to expect. Then Karahan Tepe and the wider Taş Tepeler landscape, where the first monument turned out to have neighbours. A regional horizon of repeated enclosures and carved forms, not one strange hill, but a pattern. Gunung Padang, the terraced hill in Indonesia, where older layers may sleep beneath the visible stone. A buried depth that makes the surface feel like only the latest skin of a much older body. Doggerland, the missing country beneath the North Sea. A whole inhabited landscape of rivers, wetlands, and human camps, erased not by catastrophe, but by the slow, ordinary rise of the sea. A reminder that water can remove entire worlds from the archaeological record. Atlit Yam, the village under the Mediterranean. Real houses, real wells, real graves, now resting below the waterline. Proof that human settlements can become underwater archives, silent and complete. Dwarka, the sacred city remembered as drowned. A tradition that does not merely say a city was great, but that the sea came for it. A memory attached to a coastline preserved in story long after the original stones were covered. Puma Punku, where repeated H blocks and recessed forms speak a stone language of planning and standardization. A craft knowledge that survived its makers, a design logic still visible even when the method is lost. Baalbek, the foundation too heavy to ignore. enormous stones at the base of a later temple, carrying a question of motive and scale that the structures above them could not erase. And Nan Madol, the city built on coral and memory. Basalt columns stacked across artificial islets, a monumental world rising from the sea in one of the most remote places on Earth, proving that oceanic landscapes could hold complex organized power. Each of these cases carried a different trace of a lost world, a sacred center, a regional horizon, a buried layer, a missing coastline, a drowned settlement, a mythic memory, a repeated craft, an inherited foundation, an oceanic logistics, and now the King List adds the final piece, a written record that does not describe a monument or a landscape but names the fracture directly. Before the flood, after the flood. The same structure that echoes through hundreds of flood stories around the world, found here in one of the earliest texts we can read. This is not proof of a single global empire spanning the continents. One clay tablet cannot carry a claim that large, but the pattern is harder to dismiss than any single site taken alone. The stones, the drowned places, the old stories, they begin to point in the same direction. The simple ladder of history, the clean sequence from hunter to farmer to city to writing, feels smaller now. Not foolish, but incomplete. Because the traces keep appearing where they should not be, if the textbook sequence were the whole truth. The King List transforms the journey. It turns a collection of separate ruins into a coherent argument, that lost worlds leave traces, and that human memory preserves the shape of the catastrophe, even when exact dates, names, and details have long since blurred. But the power of the King List is not only in what it says, it is in what it does to the 9 cases that came before. They stop being separate sites. They become pieces of one larger question. The King List named the fracture. Now we step back and look at the whole map. 10 traces. Each one a different answer to the same quiet question. What would a vanished world leave behind? Göbekli Tepe gave us a sacred center, carved pillars rising before the expected machinery of cities. Karahan Tepe and the Taş Tepeler turned one strange hill into a regional horizon, a landscape of repeated monumental enclosures. Gunung Padang showed how an older layer can hide inside a hillside, a green surface resting on older human decisions. Then the water cases. Doggerland made the missing coastline real, a whole country of rivers, animals and camps, now under the North Sea. Atlit Yam preserved a drowned village, its wells and burials still visible on the seabed, a place where people once stood on dry ground and watched a shoreline that no longer exists. Dwarka carried the memory of a sacred city swallowed by water, a story that clung to the coast long after the waves had covered the original world. After the water, the stones that remained above it. Puma Punku offered repeated stone forms, H-blocks and recesses that feel less like rubble than pieces from a system. Baalbek left a foundation so heavy that later empires built upon it without fully explaining it, a base whose scale keeps exceeding the story placed on top. Nan Madol rose on coral, a maritime stone world where black basalt columns crossed artificial islets, and water moved through the city like streets. Finally, the oldest written memory. The Sumerian King List divided time in 2. Kings before the flood, kings after, a line that cuts history with a single phrase. The flood swept over. None of these alone can carry the weight of a lost civilization. But together they form a staircase. Sacred architecture, regional repetition, buried depth, erased coastlines, submerged homes, mythic memory, repeated craft, inherited foundation, oceanic logistics, and a text that names the fracture. Each case adds one more reason to suspect that the simple ladder of progress is too small. The past did not survive evenly. What remains is the surface, dry land, stone, clay. The deepest archives may be underwater, buried, or transformed into story. That is not a fragile claim. It is a cumulative weight. But roles and sites are still separate. Let them now fuse into a single picture. A carved pillar, a drowned landscape, a submerged village, a heavy foundation, a clay record of kings before the flood. Now let these images draw together, not as a list, as a single wounded map. A T-shaped pillar lifting its stone arms from a hill in southeastern Turkey, carved with foxes and birds, raised before the usual machinery of cities was supposed to explain such work. Another carved enclosure on a nearby ridge, and then another, as if the landscape once held a whole network of sacred gathering places. A green hill in Java, terraced with columnar stones that may hide older human layers deep inside itself. A drowned plain of rivers and marsh under the North Sea, a country of hunters and fishers that no longer touches the air. Stone houses and a well now resting under the Mediterranean, where people once drew fresh water and buried their dead. A sacred coast in western India, where memory still holds the shape of a city swallowed by the sea, a story that refused to sink even after the water came. Blocks carved into repeated H-forms on the high plain of Bolivia, a design language that feels planned, standardized, too systematic to be rough improvisation. A foundation stone in Lebanon so heavy that later empires simply built upon it, as if the first builders left a platform too large to move and too permanent to erase. Basalt columns stacked across a coral reef in the Pacific, a watery city of canals and islets built through distance, salt, and immense labour. And a clay prism in a museum case, covered in wedge-shaped marks that divides time with a single line, the flood swept over. Each of these is a fragment, a piece of a larger story that water, burial, decay, and later inheritance hid or distorted. The T-shaped pillar survived because it was buried on purpose, not because it was protected by a city wall. The drowned plain survived only as bones and tools dragged up in fishing nets. The submerged houses survived because the sea rose slowly enough to leave the stone foundations in place. The memory of Dwarka survived because generations of storytellers carried it, shaping and reshaping the loss into a sacred shape. The H-block survived because the stone itself was too hard to disappear, even after the exact methods of the carvers had faded from memory. The foundation stones of Baalbek survived because they were too heavy to recycle and too embedded in the ground to be forgotten. The basalt islets of Nan Madol survived because the ocean that could have swallowed them instead embraced them, turning the city into a reef-locked mystery. And the clay prism survived because someone, thousands of years ago, pressed marks into soft clay and then baked it hard, as if they wanted a record of the before and after to outlast them. The visible timeline is not a clean museum. It is a broken archive. What we see on dry land is not everything that was built, only the fraction that erosion, reuse, burial, and sheer luck allowed to remain. The earliest coastlines, where human life was often richest, are now under meters of water. Wood, textiles, baskets, stories told without writing, all vanish unless some rare condition preserves them. So the surviving surface is not the first chapter, it is the first chapter we can still read. And that is why a reasonable viewer might feel doubt right now. Holding all these images at once can feel like holding too much. But that is exactly the point. The past is not a clean sequence of neat rooms, each one leading logically to the next. It is a scattered, wounded record. And when you gather the fragments, the pillar, the hill, the drowned plain, the submerged village, the sacred memory, the repeated stone forms, the enormous foundation, the reef city, and the clay prism that says before and after, they begin to speak to the same possibility, not as a proven empire, but as a reasonable inference that older human worlds existed, left their traces in different forms, and that the standard ladder of progress, for all its usefulness, cannot contain the full weight of these stones. Now the question changes. It is no longer whether lost worlds are possible. The question becomes why the story is not already accepted, if so many fragments point in the same direction. The answer does not lie in a lack of evidence. It lies in what is missing, in the vast silence of the archive, and in the human tendency to mistake the surviving surface for the whole past. But a reasonable viewer might still ask, if all these traces are real, why isn't the story already accepted? The answer lies in what is missing, not in what is found. A reasonable viewer might still ask a fair question. If all these traces are real, pillars, drowned landscapes, heavy stones, old clay records, why is the story not already accepted? Why does the standard timeline still feel like the default answer? The difficulty lies not in the traces that survived, but in everything that did not. Imagine a library that caught fire. The building burned for hours. Most of the books became ash. A few pages survived near the edges, some buried under fallen shelves, some carried out by people who fled. If a later visitor found only those scorched pages, would they conclude that the library had always been small? Or would the surviving fragments make the fire itself the most important part of the story? The human past is a burned library, and the fire was time, Wood disappears, coastlines drown, oral traditions die with the last voice that remembered them. Mud bricks dissolve into the same soil they came from. Later builders reuse older stones, carving their own names over foundations they did not always understand. Sea levels rose slowly after the last ice age, and the places where early people lived, the richest coastal edges, became the seafloor. The surviving record is not a fair sample of what once existed. It is what happened to be made of stone, or clay, or placed on high ground. The rest is silence. Archaeologists call this preservation bias. It is not a secret. It is a fact that even the most careful scholars acknowledge. The trouble is that preservation bias is often treated as a footnote, something to mention before moving quickly back to the visible ruins. But if the bias is real, then the footnote is actually the headline. The visible ruins may be the exception, not the rule. The rule may be loss. That does not mean we can invent whatever we wish. The gaps are not a blank check. They are a specific shape. We know where the losses are likely. Ancient coastlines now under the sea, wooden structures that rotted, stories that were never written, stones that were carried away and recut for new walls. Recognizing the shape of the missing record does not invite fantasy. It invites a harder and more honest question. If the library burned, and we are holding only a few pages, what might have been in the books that are gone? And that is why the 10 cases we have walked through matter, not as separate curiosities but as a single pattern. Göbekli Tepe showed organized sacred labor before the standard timeline expects it. Karahan Tepe and the Taş Tepeler sites showed that such labor was not a one-time accident, but a repeated horizon across a landscape. Gunung Padang raised the possibility that older layers lie hidden inside hills that later people simply walked over. Doggerland proved that entire inhabited countries can vanish beneath the sea without leaving a single roof above water. Atlit Yam proved that real settlements, with wells, burials and daily life, can rest on the seabed, waiting to be found. Dwarka showed how sacred memory can cling to a coastline long after the original world is gone. Puma Punku preserved a stone language of repetition and design that later builders inherited but could not fully explain. Baalbek left a foundation so heavy that later empires built temples on top of it, as if the older stones were meant to carry something larger than the later builders knew. Nan Madol raised the question of how a remote maritime people organized the labor to stack basalt columns across a reef. And the Sumerian King List, written in clay, divided human time into before the flood and after, as if the earliest literate people were already remembering a world that came before their own. No single one of these traces proves a lost global empire. That was never the claim. But together, they do something simpler and in a quiet way more powerful. They make the familiar ladder of civilization feel too small to hold all the human effort that clearly took place. They suggest that the visible timeline is not complete history, but a surviving surface, and they leave the viewer with a question that cannot be answered by any single excavation report. What else was in the library before it burned? That is the question we return to now, not to close the case, but to sit with it a little longer. We began with a hill in Turkey and a simple belief about how civilization grew. Most of us learned a clean ladder, small bands of hunters, then farming, then villages, then cities, then writing, then monuments. The story is not foolish. It is built on real evidence. But after 10 cases, that ladder feels smaller than it did at the start. The T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe still stand in their enclosures, carved with foxes and birds and scorpions, raised before the usual machinery of cities and kings was supposed to explain such labour. They do not disappear just because the standard timeline cannot fully hold them. They remain. And they ask the same question they asked when we first saw them. What kind of world was already strong enough to make people gather for work that did not directly feed them? What if the first civilization we can read about was already the second version? That question is not a claim of proof. It is not a declaration that a global empire ruled before the flood, or that ancient astronauts taught humans how to stack stones, or that mainstream archaeology is hiding the truth. It is something quieter and harder to dismiss. It is the recognition that the surviving traces point in a direction the simple ladder did not prepare us for. The Sumerians did not present themselves as the beginning. Their own records named kings who ruled before the flood, in cities that were already old when the first written words were pressed into clay. The Egyptians spoke of a time when gods walked the land, a time before the current order. The builders of Nan Madol carried basalt across water and reef, and the oral traditions that surround that place remember a dynasty that arrived from somewhere else, carrying a knowledge of stone and authority that the islands had not seen before. These are not isolated curiosities. They form a pattern. Göbekli Tepe shows organised sacred labour before the expected package of farming and cities. Karahan Tepe and the Taş Tepeler landscape show that the first stone was not alone. Gunung Padang raises the possibility that older layers sleep beneath the visible surface. Doggerland proves that entire inhabited landscapes can vanish under the sea. Atlit Yam proves that human settlements can pass below the waterline and survive only as fragments on the seabed. Dwarka preserves the memory of a sacred city swallowed by the sea, a story that clings to a real coastline where underwater traces have been found. Puma Punku preserves a stone language of repetition and design that later generations could not fully read. Baalbek preserves a foundation so heavy that later empires built their temples on top of it, as if inheriting a platform whose original purpose had already been forgotten. Nan Madol preserves a monumental world built through water, where logistics and authority met on a coral reef. And the Sumerian King List preserves the written memory of a before and an after, divided by a flood. 10 cases, 10 different kinds of trace. The episode does not end with a closed answer. It ends with a reframed question. Not, did lost civilizations exist? But, how many human worlds may have left traces that we are only beginning to learn how to read? That question carries a different weight. It does not ask the viewer to believe in fantasy. It asks the viewer to look at the surviving surface and recognize that it may not be the whole story. The archive is incomplete. Wood disappears. Wood. Coastlines drown. Stories die with the last voice. Later empires build over older foundations and rename what they find. Sacred centres are buried, sometimes deliberately, by the same people who once gathered there. The clearest records survive on dry land, and the oldest questions may rest under water, under stone, under myth. This is not a failure of evidence. It is the shape of the evidence itself. The broken archive is not an excuse. It is the reason the few traces that remain matter so much. We're not standing at the end of a solved history. We're standing on the surface of a much deeper archive, holding a handful of fragments that do not fit the simple story. What if the first page we can read was not the first page ever written by human life? Maybe it was only the first page that survived. But behind every stone, every drowned coast, every inherited foundation, there were people. Not just builders, but those who remembered. But behind every stone, every drowned coast, every inherited foundation, there were people. Not just builders, but those who remembered. Think of the hands that first cut into the limestone at Göbekli Tepe. Every pillar pulled from the quarry meant weeks of chipping and dragging under an open sky. A single misstep could crush a body. A single season of work could strip a family of its hunters and gatherers. And still they returned, again and again, to raise shapes that held no food and offered no shelter. Something in them needed the stone to stand. Walk now across the dry bed of what was once Doggerland. Under the North Sea, hidden by cold water, are the soft hills where children played, the river banks where fish were caught, the camps where fires burned and stories were told. No monument marks those places. Only the bones dredged up by fishing trawlers and the quiet maps drawn by geologists remind us that a whole inhabited country once stretched between what is now England and Denmark. The water did not come in a single terrifying wave. It rose so slowly that no single generation could see the danger. But over centuries the coastline retreated, the land shrank, and one day there was no dry path left to walk. Sink deeper to the Mediterranean floor off the coast of Israel. There, at Atlit Yam, the sea preserved something rarer than a ruin. It preserved the shape of daily life. A stone well still holding fresh water long after the village around it drowned. A circle of stones around a grave placed by mourners who could not imagine the sea would one day cover their dead. A small house floor, where someone once swept ashes from a hearth and looked out toward a shoreline that no longer exists. These were not mythical people. They drew water. They buried their parents. They watched the horizon change. Then let your mind travel to the quarry at Baalbek, where a single stone, still half attached to the bedrock, weighs over 1,000 tons. Imagine the bodies that gathered around it. The ropes, the wooden rollers, the voices calling in rhythm, the hunger at the end of the day, the children waiting for food, the certainty that this task mattered, even though no ordinary need could justify it. Those builders are nameless now, their language is lost, but their decision to cut stone on a scale far beyond any practical demand is still there, still heavy, still waiting for an explanation that does not shrink the human effort involved. These are not just archaeological puzzles, they are fragments of whole human worlds. Each pillar, each submerged campsite, each drowned house, each megalithic block was once surrounded by songs, names, jokes, fears, and small daily rituals that left no trace. The silence we hear when we look at these ruins is not the original silence. It is the echo of everything that did not survive. This is not sentimentality. It is the quiet recognition that history is not only about the things that remain, it is also about the immense invisible weight of what has been lost. The stone that stands is the exception. The memory that continues is the miracle. Most of what people loved, most of what they built, most of what they believed, vanished without a word, and that vanishing is not a failure of the evidence. It is the very condition of being human. So when we speak of lost civilizations, we are not only talking about missing cities, we are talking about missing people, the ones who sang the songs we will never hear, the ones who named the stars in languages that died with the last speaker, the ones who stood on a coastline and watched the water rise year after year until the land that held their ancestors was gone. That is the quiet grief that sits behind all 10 cases. Not despair, not hopelessness, but a deeper connection to the past rooted in the simple fact that these traces were left by people who didn't know they would be forgotten. They built, they mourned, they told stories, they moved stones, and they trusted that something of their world would last. In a way they were right. Fragments remain, but the whole is gone. And so we end where the Sumerians ended, with a line. The flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descended again, and so we end where the Sumerians ended, with a line. The flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descended again. That single sentence, pressed into clay more than 4,000 years ago, does not explain itself. It does not offer evidence, argument, or proof. It simply cuts history in two, a world before the water and a world after. And it quietly assumes that the listener already knows what was lost. We began with a ladder, bands of hunters. The slow turn to farming, villages growing into cities, kings, writing, monuments, a clean story, easy to teach, easy to trust. But then we placed a carved stone pillar from Göbekli Tepe on the lower rungs of that ladder, and the rungs began to bend. Not because the ladder was foolish, because it was too short. We saw other hills with older layers inside them. We saw a country now called Doggerland, where rivers once ran, animals moved, and human camps dotted a landscape that is now only sea. We saw a village off the Mediterranean coast, its well and its burial still resting below the waterline, exactly where people left them when the shoreline moved. We saw sacred traditions that remember cities swallowed by the ocean, not as metaphor but as memory too persistent to be only story. We saw stone cut with a discipline that still looks planned, repeated, systematic. We saw foundations so heavy that later builders simply left them in place and built on top, because the stones were too large to move and too stubborn to ignore. We saw an island city of black basalt rising from a reef, crossed by canals, holding its own memory in oral tradition and silent block. And at the end, we returned to clay, a small prism in a museum case, wedge-shaped marks, the names of kings who ruled before the flood, for spans of time that do not fit into ordinary human life, then the line, then the world we think we know. None of this proves a single global empire. None of it proves that every flood myth records the same event. None of it proves that the standard picture of history is a lie. But it does something quieter and perhaps harder to ignore. It makes the surviving surface feel incomplete. It makes the gaps between the ruins feel less empty and more like places where something once stood, something that did not leave a name. It leaves the viewer not with a verdict, but with a changed way of looking at a map, a stone, a coastline, a museum case. The past is not solved. It has only survived unevenly. The clearest records are on dry land. The oldest questions are under water, under stone, under myth. Maybe the first page we can read was not the first page ever written by human life. Maybe it was only the first page that survived. The rest is still waiting. Quietly. Under the sea. Inside the hills. Carved into stone that no one living can fully read. The ladder is still there, but now it feels shorter than it did, and the space below it, where the older stories might still be, is wider than we were taught to imagine.